something to think about.
Shalom and greetings. We welcome you to this week's Sabbath message. This week's Sabbath message is entitled Overwhelming Truth. Overwhelming truth establishes the origin of all things, and the origin does not change. So please allow yourself to focus on this principle that overwhelming truth establishes the origin of all things, and the origin does not change. Allow yourself to focus on this principle. It can remove the darkness and replace it with the light of truth. It is a sad state of affairs when the origin of scriptural truth is not ascertained, is not established by an overwhelming amount of truth. Instead by mistruths and traditions. It's a sad state of affairs. And furthermore, the origin of scriptural truth, which the scripture shares never changes, has and is being changed without an overwhelming amount of truth. Sad state of affairs. Even more disheartening is that the changing has and is being done by those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers. Now, we have shared in other episodes and messages the scripture, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. So let us read. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15 reads, Study to show thyself approved unto Elohim, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Rightly dividing the word of truth. In case you do not remember, the word study or spoudazo in the Greek means to hasten to do a thing, to exert oneself, endeavor, give diligence. In our modern day English, study or spoudazo means, by this definition, it means right away, right now. It means to exert ourselves. It means to continuing to exert ourselves. It means to give careful and persistent effort. And that we are studying to be approved by Yahweh Elohim, not to impress anybody else. We're studying to be approved by Yahweh Elohim. And the way we do this is by being able to rightly divide the word of truth. Which brings us back to overwhelming truth establishes the origin of all things. And the origin does not change. When overwhelming truth does not establish the origin, it allows for preposterous indoctrinations and false societal customs. And as we stated earlier, sadly, this is being done by those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church. Such ludicrous teachings as the earth is only 6,000 or so years old according to scripture, and the following of deceptive practices such as the Sabbath, the Shabbat, Yahweh Elohim's day of worship, has moved from the seventh day of the week, Saturday, to the first day of the week, Sunday. Also, that the new year has moved from starting at the beginning of spring, the end of March, to the beginning of winter, the end of December. These are just a small sampling out of numerous examples that we will show that only exist because overwhelming truth is not used to establish the origin of scriptural commandments and instructions, and that the scriptural origins have and are being changed. The absurd propaganda or marketing of how old scripture states the earth the absurd propaganda or marketing of how old scripture states the earth is clearly and plainly identified and explained by overwhelming truth in the scripture to be far more than 6,000 years old. But one must grow and move from just knowing to truly understanding scripture to ascertain, to discover this. This topic is addressed in some detail in the book, The Beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1, by his servant. We will do a cursory examination here about how old the earth is, but for a detailed account, you're encouraged to read The Beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1, by his servant. So let us go and move from just knowing to truly understanding Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. So let us read. Genesis chapter 1 reads, In the beginning, Elohim created the heaven and the earth. We've addressed in previous messages, episodes, and teachings that the phrase, the beginning, in scripture actually means here the never before, the never existed. So the word beginning means the never before, the never existed. So scripture shares at the time of the never before, the never existed, Elohim created out of nothing the heaven and the earth. But notice, it does not indicate there being any discrepancies or issues with the earth. Notice that. Let us continue with Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. It reads, And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the spirit of Elohim moved upon the face of the waters. As we've stated numerous times, the scripture we read is a transliteration of the original Hebrew Chaldee Old Testament and the original Koine Greek New Testament languages. In the original Hebrew Chaldee Old Testament language, the word was and the earth was without form. The word was in the original Hebrew Chaldee actually means become, come to pass. This is according to the Strong's Concordance, H. 1961. So, in the original Hebrew Chaldee Old Testament language, Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 would read, the earth became without form and void. So the earth became. Now, we just identified in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it does not identify or indicate any issues with the earth. So, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when it states the earth was, or as we now know, became, it is sharing with us there was something that happened between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. This is actually the time span that is before the existence of mankind. And it is the billions of years that scientists are able to validate and corroborate. Yes, the earth is billions or possibly even more years old, according to Scripture. Another scriptural example of the existence, the earth before the 6,000 years or so. So this is another example of the existence of the earth before the 6,000 or so years. Those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers of the Christian church teach. And it is in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18. Another example that the earth is older than 6,000 years. So let us read Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18 reads, "For thus saith the Lord Yahweh, that created the heavens, Elohim himself, that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it." Get this. He hath established it. He created it not in vain. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord Yahweh, and there is none else. Now, this is further overwhelming truth, overwhelming evidence that Elohim did not create, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, an earth that was without form and void. Let us grow and move from just knowing to understanding the transliterated phrase without form and void. In the original Hebrew Chaldee, this phrase without form and void means to lie waste, a desolation of surface, i.e., example, a desert. Figuratively, it means a worthless thing. Adverbially, it means in vain and undistinguishable ruin. So, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, the earth created by Elohim was not a wasteland, was not a ruin. As it states in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, it became that way. As we stated earlier, this is the explanation of the billions of years the science community has validated and corroborated. There's even more overwhelming truth, overwhelming evidence of the earth being older than the 6,000 years or so, that those who profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church, teach. And it's in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. So let us read that. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 5 reads, For this they willingly are ignorant of, that the word of Elohim, that by the word of Elohim, the heavens were of old. and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. So let's just stop right here and just deal with this for a minute. So the earth standing out of the water and in the water is really the world that we live in today. It's the same scenario because you have water. It doesn't cover all of the earth. So some of the earth is standing out of the water. Some of the earth is sitting in the water. So this is what this means. The earth standing out of the water and in the water. Okay. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 6. Let's continue. Whereby the world, get this, what it's saying, whereby this world that it was just talking about, that by the word of Elohim, the heavens were of old, and the earth was standing out of the water and in the water. Whereby 2 Peter 3:6 reads, the world that then was. So that world that then was standing out of the water and in the water. So whereby the world that then was, it was being overflowed with water, perished. So the earth was no longer standing in the water and out of the water. It was overflowed by water. And that world that then was, that's what it calls it. Here in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 6, the world that then was, so that means it's no longer, it was overflowed with water. It perished. So that earth is no more. Let's continue. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. But the heavens and the earth which are now. That means this is a new earth, heaven and earth. Because that world that then was, it perished. But in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, it reads, but the heavens and the earth which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. This is not all of the overwhelming evidence, but for the sake of time, we'll stop here. It is asinine, it is foolish that those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church, teach such absurdity and dispute overwhelming truth given by both the scripture and the scientific community. Only overwhelming truth should establish the origin of all things. And if this is done, the origin will not change. The misleading ritual practiced by those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers of the Christian church, that the Sabbath, Yahweh Elohim's day of worship, has moved from the seventh day of the week, Saturday, to the first day of the week, Sunday, is a great atrocity. Once again, we've addressed this topic in great detail in the series Worshiping the Sabbath According to Scripture, which is on his servant's website and YouTube channel. We will do a passing examination here, but for a detailed account, you're encouraged to watch the two-part series, Worshiping the Sabbath According to Scripture. The Sabbath is not officially mentioned in Scripture until Exodus chapter 16, but is first addressed in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. So let us read. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 reads, and on the seventh day, singular, get this, Elohim ended his work which he had made. He rested on the seventh day, singular, from all his work which he had made. Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. And Elohim blessed the seventh day, singular, and sanctified it, just the seventh day, made it holy, because that in it he had rested, only rested on the seventh day, from all his work which Elohim created and made. Now, Scripture shares Elohim ended his work in 6 days, plural. That no work was done on the seventh day, singular. More overwhelming evidence is given in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. Let us read. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 reads, "For in 6 days, plural, the Lord Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day, singular. Wherefore the Lord Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day, singular, and hallowed it." Scripture reveals that obedience to honoring the Sabbath is important to Yahweh Elohim. By Yahweh Elohim blessing the Sabbath and sanctifying, hallowing it, setting it apart, sharing exactly when it has to be honored, and that is on the 7th day, singular. The second time the word Sabbath is used in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. So let us read that. This is the second time the word Sabbath is used, and it's used in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 reads, "Remember the Sabbath day, singular, to keep just it holy." Exodus chapter 20, verse 9, "6 days, plural, shalt thou labor and do all thy work." Exodus chapter 20, verse 10, "But the 7th day, singular, is the Sabbath of the Lord Yahweh, thy Elohim. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor the stranger that is within thy gates." Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, "For in 6 days, plural, the Lord Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day, singular. Wherefore the Lord Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day, singular, and hallowed it." That's the 7th day it's talking about. The scripture commands the followers of Yahweh Elohim to remember the Sabbath. So, does the scripture allow for the Sabbath to be honored on any other day than the 7th day? Both the Old and New Testament / covenant provide a clear and unanimous, resounding response. So let us read. Starting in the Old Testament / covenant, we're going to go to the book of Psalms, chapter 89, and read verse 34. It reads, this is Yahweh speaking, "My covenant will I not break nor alter." My covenant, my commandment, I will not break nor alter the thing that is gone out of my lips. Let us look at another example in the Psalms, chapter 111, verses 7 through 8. Psalm chapter 111, verse 7 reads, "The works of his hands are verity, their truth and judgment. All his commandments are sure." All his commandments are sure. Psalm chapter 111, verse 8, "They stand fast, don't move, forever and ever, and are done in truth and uprightness." Let us look at Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 14. It reads, "I know that whatsoever Elohim doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. And Elohim doeth it that men should fear before him." One more example here in the Old Testament / covenant. Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. "For I am the Lord Yahweh, I change not. Therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed." Let us look at some New Testament / covenant examples. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Think not, don't believe that I am come to destroy the law." Don't think that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, it continues, for verily I say unto you. So in the Gospel of Matthew 5:17, this is Yeshua speaking now. He says, not only did I not come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. He continues in the Gospel of Matthew 5:18 saying, for verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law. So none of that's going away. Till heaven and earth pass, none of that is going away till all be fulfilled. One more example in the New Testament / covenant, the book of James, chapter 1, verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness. There is no variableness, like, well, we don't really know. Neither shadow of turning. Scripture validating scripture in both the Old and New Testament / covenant shows that what Yahweh Elohim establishes does not change. Validating, once again, with overwhelming truth, overwhelming evidence, the Sabbath should always be honored on the seventh day of every week. The word Sabbath, or the phrase Sabbath day, is used 59 times in the New Testament / covenant. And it is always associated with the seventh day of the week. Always associated with the seventh day of the week. Now, as we grow from just knowing and understanding, Scripture reveals there is another word transliterated in the New Testament / covenant that has the same exact Greek definition as Sabbath. This word is week. Week, W-E-E-K. And is used 9 times, 7 times in the Gospels, only twice outside the Gospels. The book of Acts uses the word Sabbath 9 times. Just the book of Acts. And every time it refers to the seventh day Sabbath or the number 7. Now, the book of Acts uses the word week only once. Now, use the word Sabbath 9 times. Every time refers to the seventh day Sabbath or the number 7. The book of Acts uses the word week only once. And we now understand that week means Sabbath in the Greek. It is understandable that believers could be confused when the words day of the words day of the are added right before the word week. So day of the and then week. It's understandable that believers could be confused when this is added. So let us read Acts chapter 20, verse 7. The one time the word week is used in the book of Acts. It is one of 2 times the word week is used outside of the Gospels. So Acts chapter 20, verse 7 reads, and upon the first day of the, remember we said it could be confused when those words day of the are added right before the word week. Acts chapter 20 reads, and upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready, get this, ready to depart on the morrow. So he preached unto them because he wasn't going to depart until tomorrow, and continued, get this, his speech until midnight. Until midnight. Now, this passage of scripture has led masses of people astray from honoring the Sabbath on the seventh day of the week to the first day. As we now understand that the word week means Sabbath in the Greek, it explains Acts chapter 20, verse 7 is describing the normal practice for the disciples. So let us just look real quick here at Acts 20 verse 7. And it says, upon the first day of the, if we now understand that word week means Sabbath. So, and upon the first day of the Sabbath, okay? So, it explains Acts chapter 20 verse 7 is describing the normal practice for the disciples. Understanding, get this now, the Sabbath starts in the evening at sunset. That's when the Sabbath, that's the first day of the Sabbath. Because as we deal with the days, we look at them, it would actually cover 2 different days. Because the scriptural Sabbath starts in the evening and ends the next evening. So it would be split between 2 actual days the way we keep time. So the Sabbath, it says, starts. It starts in the evening. So the first day or evening of the Sabbath, the disciples rest, break bread, and hear the word of Elohim on the Sabbath until midnight. That's why because they didn't start until sunset anyway. So it's 6:30, 7 o'clock. By the time it breaks, so they worshipped and fellowshipped until midnight. It also explains why Paul would not be ready to travel until the morrow, because no work is done during the Sabbath. And the Sabbath would not end until the evening of the 7th day. So even though they went to, stop the worship at midnight, they picked it back up that next day. The day wouldn't end until midnight of the next day. Changing the Sabbath from the 7th day to any other day is dangerous because it allows the credibility of Yahweh Elohim to be questioned. Lastly, we will discuss the erroneous creation, acceptance, and indoctrination of when the beginning of the year starts. Once again, by those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church. Yahweh Elohim himself shares when the new year starts in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2. So let us read. Exodus chapter 12, verse 2 reads, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. The beginning of months. It shall be, get this, he makes it very clear. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Now the Most High then shares when his very first feast day, the Passover, is to be honored forever in Exodus chapter 12, verses 6 and Exodus chapter 12, verse 14. So right after this, when he tells them when the beginning of months is, what the first month of the year is, right after this, he shares when his first feast day, the Passover, is to be honored forever. So let us read Exodus chapter 12, verse 6. It reads, And ye shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month that he just talked about in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, that first month of the year. And ye shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. Let us read Exodus chapter 12, verse 14. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord Yahweh throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. This is evidence of the importance of knowing when Yahweh Elohim's new year starts. When it begins, not only identifies when the Passover is honored, but when all of Yahweh Elohim's feast days will be honored. An interesting fact, truth. The new year started March 25th. Say this again, an interesting fact, the truth. The new year started March 25th until around 1582. That's when the new year started, March 25th. The new year starting January 1st is a relatively new phenomenon. Surprisingly, even using the secular Gregorian calendar, the secular world acknowledges the Passover is at the end of March, 1st of April time frame. So the secular world will acknowledge that the Passover is at the end of March, 1st of April time frame. Scripture commands that the Passover feast is to be a memorial, kept a feast by law forever at this appointed time. We will show overwhelming truth, evidence, by way of Yahweh Elohim's scriptural feasts of when Yahweh Elohim's scriptural year starts. The scripture shares there are 3 national feasts that all of the males of Israel were to appear before Yahweh Elohim. As we have revealed in previous messages and episodes, the number 3 represents spiritual completion in the scripture. So let us now read Exodus chapter 23, verses 14 through 17. Exodus 23 verse 14 reads, 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. 3 times in the year they shall keep a feast unto him. There are 3 national feasts that will establish when Yahweh Elohim's scriptural year begins. These 3 feasts, they're going to establish it. So let us continue with Exodus chapter 23 verse 15. Thou shalt keep, get this, thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread 7 days as I commanded thee in the appointed month, in the time appointed of the month of Abib. So there's a set time. The scripture is saying that you are to celebrate the feast of unleavened bread. He commanded them, it says, to do this in the time appointed of the month of Abib. For in it thou camest out from Egypt. So it's also saying when they came out of Egypt. And none shall appear before me empty. Now scripture shares the first of the 3 national feasts Yahweh Elohim commands his believers, followers to honor is the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the appointed month of Abib. Now again, just to be real clear, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are basically the same. The Passover was killed right before the next day started, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread is what they ate. That's when they ate the Passover lamb. So they're pretty much synonymous. So this is the time frame of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is that same time frame we read in Exodus chapter 12, verse 6, I think it was. And the 14th and 15th day, the 14th in the evening, and then the very, right after that is the 15th day. So this is this time frame. Now we just allowed Exodus chapter 12, verse 2 to reveal that Yahweh Elohim established this is the first month of the year. Okay? So let us go and move from just knowing to understanding the word Abib in the Hebrew Chaldee language. The Strong's Concordance defines Abib as from the unused root, meaning to be tender. This is the definition of Abib. An unused root meaning to be tender, green, i.e. a young ear of grain, suggesting the beginning of spring. Now, this is the definition in the Strong's Concordance. Abib, by definition, suggests the beginning of spring. Even the secular world would agree the beginning of spring is the time frame of the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Because mistakenly, they agree with this because mistakenly they associated with their Easter Resurrection Sunday celebration. mistakenly. That's a whole nother topic that we've covered. We won't address that here, but they would agree that the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is the beginning of spring, because they're mistakenly associated with their Easter/Resurrection Sunday celebration. Now, we just validated the scripture states the time frame of the Passover / the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the first month of the scriptural year. So this time frame is the end of the third month or beginning of the fourth month of the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar, which starts the first month of the year, January, in the beginning of winter, it creates a problem to follow Yahweh Elohim's instruction as to when his believers are to honor his feast days. Because if he's calling this the first month of the year, and the Gregorian calendar, which the majority of the world uses, it's actually there into the third month, the beginning of the fourth month, it creates a problem to follow Yahweh Elohim's instructions as to when his believers and followers are to honor his feast days. Scripture states Yahweh Elohim is not the author of confusion in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. So let us read. First Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33 reads, "For Elohim is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints." In this passage of scripture, there is no ambiguity or vagueness of Yahweh Elohim not contributing to anything confusing. It also shares more overwhelming truth, evidence that the original ecclesia churches were not confused about the origins of Yahweh Elohim's commandments and instructions. They weren't confused. He says in there, he's not the author of confusion, but of peace. They're at peace as in all churches of the saints. They weren't confused. Unlike those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church, they are confused. The current Christian church is instructing its believers and followers to follow and govern themselves by the secular Gregorian calendar, which starts its first month of the year, the beginning of winter. According to scripture in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 5 and 6, on the eve of the 14th day, which is also just before the beginning of the 15th day of the first month, is the Passover. It's the start of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. How can those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church, reconcile this? That actually the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which they associate with their Easter/Resurrection Sunday celebration, it clearly states that's the first month of the year. They're doing it at the end of the third or the beginning of the fourth month of the year. How do they reconcile this with scripture? Let us read Leviticus chapter 23, verses 5 through 6. Leviticus 23, verse 5 reads, "In the 14th day of the first month, Abib, at even, is the Lord's Passover." That's when they were to kill the lamb, the sacrificial lamb. And then Leviticus chapter 23, verse 6 will continue to read, "And on the 15th day of the same month," because they killed it in the evening on the 14th day, after they killed it and cleaned it, the evening, then it turns into the 15th day, because the day changes in the evening. So, and on the 15th day of the same month, that first month of Abib, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's when they ate the Passover lamb. So, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Yahweh, the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Let us return to Exodus chapter 23, verse 16, and examine the second and third national feasts that established Yahweh Elohim's scriptural calendar. Exodus chapter 23, verse 16 reads, and the feast of harvest, the feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labors, which thou hast sown in the field, that's the second, and the feast of ingathering, would be the third, which is in the end of the year when thou hast gathered in thy labors out of the field. Now, the second national feast is the Feast of Harvest, or what we would know as the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. What we need to know about this feast is that it is addressing the wheat harvest. Okay? Remember, it says the Feast of Harvest, the first fruits of thy labors. It's addressing the wheat harvest. And this is validated and corroborated in Exodus chapter 34, verse 22. So let us read Exodus chapter 34, verse 22. And thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks. Remember, we said that that Feast of Weeks is actually also the Feast of Harvest. It's the Feast of Harvest. It's also called the Feast of Weeks. It's also called Pentecost. So in Exodus chapter 34, verse 22 is calling it the Feast of Weeks. And thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of wheat harvest. Okay? And the Feast of Ingathering at year's end. But we're going to just stick to this one right now. The Feast of Ingathering is the third. We're sticking with this second one now. So the second one here is identified with it being associated with the wheat harvest. The Feast of Weeks, thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of wheat harvest. Okay? So further overwhelming truth, evidence comes from Yahweh Elohim's nature, from just nature. Now, get this. The grain wheat is planted in the fall. So the grain wheat is planted in the fall, usually between October and December of the Gregorian calendar, and grows over the winter to be harvested in the spring or early summer. Okay? It's to be harvested in the spring or early summer. Now, the Feast of Harvest Weeks, or the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, according to Scripture, is to be honored in the third month of the 5th day of Yahweh Elohim's scriptural year. His scriptural year. Okay? So, 50 days after the start of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this is instructed in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 15 through 16. So let us read. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15 reads, and ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Shabbat, after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Continue reading in Leviticus 23, verse 16. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days. And ye shall offer a new meat offering unto Yahweh the Lord. According to the overwhelming evidence, the overwhelming truth of Yahweh Elohim's nature and when the wheat harvest is expected, this would be the beginning of the third month of Yahweh Elohim's scriptural calendar. Okay? The third month. Because remember, we're already halfway through the month. The first month is 50 days. So you got another 15 days. And that's the first month. You got another 30 days. Second month. So that's in the second month. You got 5 left over. So now you've got the third month, the 5th day. This all adds up. So according to Yahweh Elohim's nature, and when the wheat harvest is expected, this would be the beginning of the third month of Yahweh Elohim's scriptural calendar. Remembering, the Gregorian calendar starts 3 months earlier than Yahweh Elohim's scriptural calendar. So, This would actually be the end of the 5th month, May, or beginning of the 6th month, June, of the Gregorian calendar, which lines up perfectly to when the wheat is to be harvested in the spring or early summer. So the spring starts in April. It says that it's harvested in the spring, which would still be May. June, you're starting to get into early summer. So it lines right up. Okay? Once again, the question must be asked. Because remember now, it's 3 months earlier. So, that's why it's not lining up with the Gregorian calendar. Because the scriptural calendar is 3 months. It's 3 months after. So when they would count 3 months, it would actually be 6 months. So that's why we're in May and June of the Gregorian calendar. Once again, the question must be asked, how can those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church, reconcile this? That it's supposed to be in the 3rd month, but actually, when we go and we look at when the wheat is harvested, it's in the 6th month. How can they reconcile this? Let us go back to Exodus chapter 23, verses 15 through 17, and Exodus chapter 34, verse 22, and recap the first 2 national feasts that we've covered, and analyze the last of the national feasts, that 3rd one that establishes Yahweh Elohim's scriptural year. Exodus chapter 23, verse 15 reads, "Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread." Covered that. That's the first. "Thou shalt eat unleavened bread 7 days as I commanded thee in the time appointed of the month of Abib," the very first month of the year. "For in it thou camest out from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty." Exodus chapter 23, verse 16. "Second, and the feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labor." We understand that's the wheat harvest, which thou hast sown in the field. "And the feast of ingathering," which is this 3rd one we're going to cover, which is in the end of the year. The feast of ingathering is telling us which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in thy labors out of the field. Exodus 23, verse 17. "3 times in the year all thy males shall appear before the Lord Yahweh Elohim." Let us skip down to Exodus chapter 34, verse 22. "And thou shalt observe the feast of weeks, of the first fruits of the wheat harvest," and that's the 2nd one, "and the feast of ingathering at the year's end." So the feast of ingathering is to be honored at the year's end. Now, the 3rd and final national feast is the feast of ingathering, or what we would know as the Feast of Tabernacles. According to the manners and customs of the Bible, it shares the Feast of Ingathering, more generally known as the Feast of Tabernacles, was instituted to remind the people that their fathers dwelt in tents in the wilderness, and also, get this, in addition to be an annual Thanksgiving. I'm going to say this again. This is what the Feast of Ingathering was designed to be. It was to be reminded people that their fathers dwelt in tents in the wilderness, but also in addition to be an annual Thanksgiving. He already had a Thanksgiving already set up. "After all the products of the earth, corn, fruit, wine, and oil were gathered for the year." This is the year end that he's talking about. Once again, Yahweh Elohim's nature, his nature provides overwhelming truth, evidence of Yahweh Elohim's scriptural calendar. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 34, it shares when the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Tabernacles, is to be honored and celebrated. Let us read Leviticus chapter 23, verse 34. "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto Yahweh the Lord." Yahweh Elohim's scriptural calendar's 7th month is the beginning of fall. lining up with the previous 2 national feast day celebrations. This is in accordance with Yahweh Elohim's nature of when the last harvest is harvested. This would be the end of the 9th month, September, the beginning of the 10th month, October, of the Gregorian calendar. This is another problematic issue of not allowing overwhelming truth to establish the origin and allowing the origin to be changed. How can those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers of the Christian church reconcile this? That Yahweh Elohim tells us to honor this in the 7th month, but actually this would be around the 10th month time frame, the end of the 9th month, the beginning of the 10th month time frame. How do they reconcile this? These are just a few scriptural selections of overwhelming truth, overwhelming evidence that's not establishing the origin of all things. It's not using overwhelming truth, overwhelming evidence to establish the origin of all things. And the origin having been changed from the 7th month to the 10th month, as we just saw, from the 3rd month to the 6th month, as we just saw. These are just a few examples of those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, followers, the Christian church, changing Yahweh Elohim's origin with ludicrous teachings and indoctrinations, as well as deceptive traditions, customs, and rituals. There are many other preposterous propaganda and deceiving practices being espoused and promoted by those that profess and claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church. Prayerfully, with what you have come to understand about the importance of overwhelming truth, establishing the origin of all things and the origin never changing, will inspire you to challenge what you've been taught, indoctrinated about the origin of all things. This is actually a scriptural principle. Not to just accept, but test. So let us go to 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. Let us read. 1 John chapter 4, verse 1 reads, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of Elohim, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. Now, interestingly, the Vine's Expository Dictionary definition of spirit and spirits in this particular passage of scripture, this is the definition. Those who claim to be depositories of these gifts. Those who claim to be depositories of these gifts. That's the definition in this passage. So this passage is actually warning us of not believing just anybody, because there are many that claim to be, what does he say? Because many false prophets are gone into the world. Because many claim to be Yahweh Elohim's teachers, believers, and followers, the Christian church. It's warning us to try those that claim to be. I would like to invite you to continue to fellowship and worship the Sabbath with the Ecclesia next Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. In addition, please join the Ecclesia every Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for prayer. The link for both is provided on his servant's website. Something to think about. If you're seeking a blessing, be a blessing. If this message of something to think about has been a blessing, assist us with your time, talents, and finance. and continue to grow and move from just knowing to truly understanding the word of the Most High, Yahweh Elohim. Peace and blessings.
His servant encourages you and prays that you will continue with him on the journey of growing and moving from just knowing to understanding the word of the Most High, Yahweh Elohim. To support you on your journey, his servant offers the following resources. His servant email address. Please feel free to reach out to his servant at any time with any questions, concerns, suggestions, and/or comments. His servant website and his servant YouTube channel. You are encouraged to subscribe to be alerted of new content. In addition, his servant recommends reading or listening to the beginning of Scriptural Truth, Volume 1. It affords a strong beginning foundation in not just knowing, but understanding the Scripture.